The Last Day of Death Row Inmate, Charles Rodman Campbell, the monster they let go. What happens when a system built to protect the innocent gives a monster a second chance and 3 people end up dead because of it? On May the 26th, 1994, Charles Rodman Campbell awoke inside Washington State Penitentiary, knowing it would be his final day alive. He had terrorized, assaulted, and ultimately ended the lives of 3 innocent people in one of the most horrifying crimes in the state's history. But what made this case even more shocking? He was only free to kill because the justice system had let him out early. As the sun rose, Campbell remained silent, calculating, and defiant. The method of execution? Hanging, a form of death the country had nearly abandoned. And by midnight, he'd be only the 3rd person in modern U.S. history to face it. This is the final 24 hours of Charles Rodman Campbell, a chilling end to a man who never showed remorse, and whose story reshaped Washington's death penalty forever. Dear friends, Charles Rodman Campbell's final day began with a silence that felt heavier than any cell door. At 6:00 a.m. on May the 26th, 1994, inside Washington State Penitentiary, Campbell opened his eyes to the gray light filtering through the concrete walls. This wasn't just another day in solitary, it was his last. For more than a decade, he had been the most feared man on Washington's death row, and now the system that once failed to contain him was preparing to bring his story to an end, not with a needle, but with a rope. Campbell's journey to this point was one marked by escalating violence and systemic oversight. Born on October the 21st, 1954, in Oahu, Hawaii, his early years were shaped by chaos. Due to concurrent sentencing and parole policies, Campbell became eligible for work release in just 6 years. Despite a documented pattern of prison violence, including assaults, threats, and even sexual violence against other inmates, was transferred to a facility in Monroe, Washington. By April 1982, he was free to roam. And that's when the horror unfolded. On April the 14th, 1982, Campbell returned to the home of Renee Wickland, the very woman who had helped put him behind bars. Inside the home were Renee, now 31, her 9-year-old daughter Shayna, and a visiting neighbor, Barbara Hendrickson. What happened next was a triple murder of unimaginable cruelty. Campbell bludgeoned and assaulted all 3 victims, slitting their throats, including nearly decapitating little Shayna. Evidence was overwhelming: his bloody fingerprint on a glass, jewelry strewn along the walkway, blood in his car, and a trail of discarded items in a nearby river. Campbell was arrested at the Monroe Reformatory days later. He never spoke a word in court about the crimes. Convicted and sentenced to death in December 1982, he began the slow, winding journey through the appeal system. For 12 years, his legal team fought the sentence, challenging the method of execution, the handling of his trial, and arguing that hanging was cruel and unusual. Time and time again, courts disagreed. By May 1994, all appeals were exhausted. His death was scheduled for May the 27th. And so the final 24 hours began. At 6:00 a.m., Campbell awoke in the same cell where he had spent over a decade. Dursley, cold and unrepentant. He had refused to choose between Washington's 2 execution methods, hanging or lethal injection. By law, that meant he would be hanged. And so, prison officials turned to an old manual from the U.S. Army to prepare the gallows. They measured his weight, 220-pound sand, calculated that a 5-foot drop would break his neck swiftly. The rope was custom-made and tested repeatedly. The trapdoor was opened and closed multiple times to ensure no last-minute mishaps. By noon, preparations intensified. In an unusual move, Governor Mike Lowry, who personally opposed the death penalty, agreed to meet Campbell that evening. There was still a sliver of hope. Clemency could be granted. But Lowry had also met with the victims' families and was flooded with thousands of letters, most demanding justice. In the end, the governor chose not to intervene. At 6:00 p.m., he met with Governor Lowry in a secured section of death row. The content of that meeting remains mostly confidential, but it changed nothing. Campbell was out of time. He spent his final hours with his son, his attorney, and the prison counselor with whom he'd once fathered a child. Point 1. At 10:30 p.m., he was served a last meal, a fish dinner. He ate little of it. Appetite had long left him. By 11:45 p.m., prison officials attempted to move him to the holding cell near the gallows, but Campbell collapsed on the floor, forcing officers to strap him to a board. He became combative, delaying the process. Guards used pepper spray to regain control. As they strapped him down, they prepared for one last unsettling walk. At 12:05 a.m. on May the 27th, Campbell was wheeled into the execution chamber, still strapped to the board. He continued resisting moving his head and making it difficult to place the black hood over his face. Once secured, the executioner pulled the lever. The trapdoor opened and Charles Rodman Campbell dropped 5 feet. His neck snapped instantly. Witnesses described the moment as fast and clinical. At 12:14 a.m., he was pronounced dead. Campbell's legacy is one of destruction, not just of the lives he took, but of the trust people once had in the justice system. He had every warning sign of a dangerous predator, yet was released and 3 innocent lives were lost as a result. Incredibly, in 2023, DNA evidence linked Campbell to another unsolved murder from 1975, the killing of university student Hyann Seaman. Even from beyond the grave, his crimes continued to surface. His story forces us to ask difficult questions. How do we weigh justice against human rights? Can someone this violent ever be safely rehabilitated? And most painfully, how many more lives would have been spared had he never been released? Charles Rodman Campbell's final 24 hours were cold, calculated, and reflective of a man who never expressed true remorse. For some, that hanging brought closure. For others, it highlighted a system that only acted after it was too late. As the trapdoor slammed open beneath Charles Rodman Campbell, it marked not just the end of a man, but the final chapter in one of Washington State's darkest failures. His execution on May the 27th, 1994, came too late for the 3 victims he brutalized, and the families forever shattered by his actions. For 12 years he fought the sentence, but never once showed true remorse. In the end, he left this world, as he had lived in it, defiant, dangerous, and disturbingly silent about the pain he caused. His story stands as a haunting reminder of the price of leniency gone wrong. Campbell should never have walked free in 1981. Yet when he did, the consequences were irreversible. Though the gallows may have silenced him, the questions remain. How do we ensure justice protects the innocent? And how many more must suffer before we learn? For the families he left broken, that silence is louder than any rope snap.